Okay, welcome everyone, and welcome to my dear friends who are attending live today. We have a beautiful, intimate, and a relational group, some close friends, my partner, and my close colleague, Krista, and my community member, and dear friend Trisha joining today. And thank you to all of those joining, let's say asynchronously through the podcast or YouTube channel. This is the Weaving the Future podcast, and I'm just kicking off a regular monthly schedule of community discussions, which are also live recordings for the YouTube and podcast. So I start by taking a bit of time just to talk about a particular subject and frame it, and then facilitate. No, I don't even want to say facilitate, throw out to the group some questions that I think are good to discuss. And over time, we'll do the work that Krista and I do in our everyday work of listening deeply to what questions are emerging for people, and then harvesting what I'm hearing and saying, okay, what questions remain? So it feels exciting to me to go into this, into these community conversations in a more regular schedule, a more regular rhythm, because I think there's a lot of discussions that people are eager to have and are already having, eager to have and are already having. So this is just one format, one place that we can have those discussions, um, and the beauty is we can have them, we can deepen our connections with each other, and then we can also share that with anyone who wants to listen through the YouTube and podcast format. There's also some things that my podcast host Buzzsprout just introduced, which is called fan mail, where you can click a link on the podcast and send me a message that goes right to my account. So anyone who's listening to the podcast is able to do that easily, in addition to just emailing or contacting me through the website. So with all of that in mind, let's jump in today. So today we're continuing the discussion that I think is underlying the discussion for the website as a whole, or sorry, the podcast as a whole, is how we can live and work in radically different ways. I've framed this question as a more accessible question than the question of, what is the world we want to live in, or what's a vision for a different world. I still ask those questions for myself, and through the work that Krista and I do with Tapestry Collective Co-op, because those questions need to be asked, and a more accessible way for us to ask them is like, for our everyday lives, what would it look like to live and work in radically different ways? And what would the larger community or society structures look like to actually support that different way of living and working? So that's the underpinning of what we'll talk about. I would like to acknowledge, before we go further, that I am living and working, loving and connecting from the land of the Hokaminam speaking peoples of the Cowichan tribes. I'm very new to this land and am really honored to be making a home here and putting down roots here. And it's a very new and ongoing journey for me to connect with this land and with the people who have stewarded this land for since time immemorial. I will say I have yet to make connections directly with folks, or elders from the Cowichan tribe, so it's on my radar that is to be done, to learn more about this land and how we might steward it. And it is it's very much at the forefront of my mind, that connection with land and the web of life, the living world, as I was hearing it called, is really needs to be a driving force of how we live and how we go about trying to shift the ways we're living. So today, the invitation I sent out for today's episode was about economic systems. And I was very aware that there's a real dryness and abstraction that tends to come about when we talk about economic systems. So my intention is to avoid that, to acknowledge that economics have become so abstracted, and that's a problem, and it actually doesn't need to be that way. So how can we talk about economics in a way that actually brings it back home, that brings the heart back into it, that brings our everyday lives back into it? I don't think I've quite gotten there in terms of like figuring out how to talk about it, but it's going to be that'll be part of the experiment today. So I am going to talk first. I will share my screen actually, for those of you joining live and those of you on YouTube. And those of you listening to the podcast, I do my best to refer to the slides, but not rely on them. So are you able to see that? Great. So I went to a conference last week. It's the first conference I've been to in a long time. And it was called Ownership Matters. And it really caught my attention. I was very excited about it because what I hoped for was that it would be a exciting way forward past the dysfunctional economic system and political system that we live in. And I was not disappointed. I'll say that, just as a quick jump to the punchline. I did have a lot of key questions emerging, which is what I'd like to focus on today, with leading into discussion among those of us that are here today. I have a feeling I really tried to like boil it down to quite simple things, and I don't have a lot to share. So depending on how much we really want to dig into this today, we might not be here for very long. The last episode, my reboot podcast episode, was a full hour and a half. Today might be a little bit shorter, and what I would like to do is seed some good questions and acknowledge that they're big and that we will probably be answering them over time and in future episodes and future discussions, not part of this podcast. So the podcast talked about community ownership, and I'll just give a definition of it so we can get an idea of what was talked about. So it emphasizes the importance of local control and democratic decision-making over the use of assets to create economic opportunities for communities. So a more accessible way to say that is the things that the community needs are owned, controlled, operated by the community members themselves. Whereas we can think about a lot of things within communities now that are not owned, operated, controlled by the communities themselves. Almost everything that we have to access in our everyday lives, from our power to the things that we buy, to our food, to our housing, depending on if you own housing privately, are owned, controlled, operated by bigger forces outside of us. And that might be government, or it might be, let's say, corporate entities that but I was really aware as I was in this conference of thinking about my life and the experience of feeling like so many things are outside of my control, and excited by the possibility that there is this movement of people all over the world trying to understand how we can bring that feeling and actuality of ownership and control back into our own hands, because that's really what we're talking about. the idea of community ownership, that the systems or the structures are designed with explicit goals to address economic inequality, promote sustainable development, and build community wealth. So my takeaway from that part of the definition is we can design structures that are for us as community members and that give back to our environment and our people rather than taking away from them. So that's exciting to consider. And then the next slide lists a whole bunch of different forms that are kind of coming forward as models of community ownership. So the biggest one is cooperatives. And I felt very proud to be part of a worker-owned cooperative. Krista and I are part of Tapestry Collective Co-op, and we are a group of consultants. We could very easily be operating as a partnership, a corporation. I have operated as a corporation in the past, or a sole proprietorship. And we made the conscious decision to be a cooperative rather than another system. And it wasn't easy because there's not a lot of supportive structures, infrastructure systems for cooperatives quite yet. It feels a bit like an old way of operating or a new way of operating. That's, we're kind of in the middle of as a society, of understanding how to structure cooperatives and how to support them. So cooperatives was kind of a main one that was kind of upheld. Other forms include community land trusts, so communities owning a piece of land rather than a private ownership. Employee ownership, which is related to cooperatives, stewardship trusts, neighborhood real estate investment trusts, community development corporations, and nonprofit and First Nations or municipal owned enterprises in real estate. So I start to read a list like that and I'm like, okay, there's a lot of like details that we could get lost in. But the idea is asking that question, what does our community need? And what are some of the formats and structures that actually help us get what we need rather than kind of feel like a barrier or take away from it? So the takeaway from this list of different forms is there's a lot being experimented with. There's a lot out there, and it was quite exciting to learn about a number of different examples or models that were out there throughout BC, throughout Canada, and then we also had some international folks, including someone who works with the government of Scotland, and some other countries as a whole are implementing not just examples, like as one-off examples, but trying to implement policies that actually support this way of communities operating and owning. So I listed a few takeaways. Our current system is designed to support and build private wealth. It's not designed to support and build shared wealth, community wealth, or let's say public held goods, or what we sometimes call the commons. And in fact, it often feels like what we heard from people doing this work or trying to have examples of community ownership, we heard back from them that it felt like the system was actually designed to be against them. They really were some big barriers to work against. And that's not by accident, not completely at least. The people who hold private wealth want to keep that. And then there's some ways that just the current system perpetuates itself, like government policies and regulations are the way they are because they're the way they are, and the people working in those systems don't necessarily have the means or the motivation or the idea, the ways of shifting those policies and regulations. The upshot of our current system supporting private wealth is that the way that it was talked about at this conference is that wealth is actually extracted from our communities rather than circulating within our communities. And so, as we look around in the last few years, especially when there's less and less housing and food is more and more expensive, it becomes harder and harder to ignore this, that our system is not designed in a way that supports most of us. And it's infuriating, frankly speaking. So again, it was very inspiring to be in a big room of people who were talking about this in an open way. Um, I move in a lot of circles in my everyday life where people talk about this in an open way, and we talk about dismantling capitalism, and that's happening more and more. And this felt like a room of, let's say, mainstream folks, at least in some ways. There was municipal governments, there were academic researchers, there were people who owned private companies. So there were more likely cooperatives, but they were doing commercial type work. And they were all sitting around in a room talking about this. I was like, yay, this is great. And I'll just go back to another takeaway that came up for me, is that community, I think I said this already, but I'll just say it again because it feels important. Community members do not hold wealth or assets as much as we could or should or deserve to, or in a way that helps us to have the actual or perceived power and control over our everyday realities. So I think one of the big takeaways that I heard about that was people assuming that our system, that our economic and political system in particular, is just a given. This is the way economics are. This is the way the world is. And we've been fed that. We've been told that. And the fact is, it's not. Our economic and political systems are created by us as people. So the good news is we have the power, we have the ability to change how they work. I think the big question, what's kind of standing in the way of us doing that, is number one, a belief that we don't think it's possible. Number two, acknowledging the reality that people are in power and will resist giving up that power. And number three, that it's hard to know where to start and how exactly to do it. So I'll say this again, but I'll jump to the punchline again and say, I think one of the ways to do it is community ownership. So yay, that's really beautiful. Let's figure out how to do that. And there's some complexities in understanding what community ownership looks like and how to get there. But I think if we're all on the same page about it, there's a better chance of us getting there. So I'm doing this podcast today partly just to let people know that, hey, there's hope. There's people talking about stuff that's like feels like it has some real chance of traction. And so I want to spread the word about that, but also start to get into the conversation of, in our communities, how can we do this? How can we do this in a way that it's not just people in a conference who are already talking this language, who are already part of, let's say, the existing system, but how can we bring this conversation into our everyday realities? And it comes up, especially for me, as someone who spends a lot of my work life in the existing systems, and then spends a lot of my personal life in communities who are actively avoiding the existing systems, and with good reason, because they don't feel empowered or seen or thriving or celebrated or celebrating, because the existing systems are just devoid of a lot of those things that we're looking for. So I spend a lot of my life asking the question of, how do we bring these worlds together? So I feel excited. This feels like one of the ways for this to happen. So what really struck me with the idea of community ownership, and another phrase they used was community wealth building, was that it's remarkably bipartisan. One of the researchers said that if they reached out to people who were sort of classically neoliberal or classically right-wing, left-wing, like different ways of leaning, that the idea of communities owning their own wealth and having control over their own assets was really unifying. This is what all of us are actually looking for. And there has been a lot of polarization, I think, at times on purpose, that pit us against each other rather than unifying us. So a classic narrative that I often hear and see is, hey, we need to do a better job of taking care of people in our community. Or, hey, our environment is literally like burning and not thriving, and species are dying, and we don't have a healthy environment that is going to be able to support us, and our climate is really shifting. And then that being met with, but what about our jobs? It's like, can we not find a place where we say yes, and we need to be able to have wealth, and everyone needs to be able to look after themselves and their families and have housing and food and all of those things. And jobs have been the classic way that we get that. And we can probably also do that, taking care of people in the environment. It feels like a no-brainer to me, and yet there's been a really deep narrative of like socialism versus neoliberalism, for example. Like I felt the need to, when I was texting my dad, who I hope will listen to this podcast episode, that we have had like great debates over the years about different political views. And we haven't always been able to find common ground. But when we start talking about cooperatives, we're like, oh, we both like cooperatives. I'm like, hey, Dad, did you know I started a cooperative? It's like, so it's such a good feeling. And yeah, I feel excited. I don't want to have rose-colored glasses that this is going to be a panacea, because I don't think it is. I think there's like a road ahead of us to understand how we can harness something like this, and probably be on the offensive and defensive. This is language that was used at the conference last week about when people try to co-opt the movement to move forward the current agenda, however we want to define that, or when they want to if there's folks that might look at what's happening and try to fight the power that's being raised or tried for. So I think I've mentioned this a little bit, but another takeaway from the conference is that there are a lot of exciting examples and models of community ownership happening already in BC, in Canada, in the world. I'll share some of those over time and with the links attached to the notes for this podcast. And then there's this question of like, how do we keep this from just being a bunch of one-offs that are happening, that, you know, they could just be a good news story that people hear and they're like, oh, I wish I had time to create that too, but I don't. How do we make this from a bunch of one-offs into a network of things that are happening, into a, you know, and ultimately into an actual like sea change, or like big change in the system itself. And there was some real like people that have been doing this work for a long time that were like, you know, we can't just talk about scale, and no, we need to talk about scale. What do we mean by scale? Like there's a lot of like debates about that I think are really interesting and important. And ultimately, one of the things I really wondered about and have been leaning into with a lot of the work that we do with Tapestry Collective is the question of how do we build an ecosystem? And if we feel into this work as ecosystem, how does that shift how we think? so that instead of maybe getting caught up in, do we scale up or scale out first? Do we get more communities involved doing a similar thing, or do we like go really deep and do a really good job of this? Instead of the either or, we say, yes, let's do all of those things. And what does it look like to build a supportive ecosystem around this work and these projects? And I recognize as I say that right now, it's probably not exactly clear to me or to you what exactly I mean. So that's a conversation I'd like to continue to have over time with this podcast, is how do we build an ecosystem? What different ecosystems do we need? And how can we draw on an ecological or environmental understanding of ecosystem to learn better how to do it when we're talking about a social ecosystem? Something that I've said I do a lot of systems change work, and I've done some systems capacity building around systems change. And something that I have said that feels really true to me is that we as living beings understand ecosystems. Our minds have forgotten that sometimes, because we think we've leaned so far into our left brains that we don't always listen to our right brains or our bodies, but our bodies understand ecosystems. So if we get out of the way, or if we let maybe our left brains or our minds get out of the way a little bit, we can feel how to do this work that needs to be done. That's big work, but it's actually not as hard, as complex, as complicated, as like effortful as a lot of the work we think we need to do. And I don't think I made a slide on this, but that was one of the main takeaways that I felt from being in a conference room full of professionals in a way that I hadn't been for a long time. It was a room full of passionate, brilliant, heartful people. And I laughed a little bit with people that are in other parts of my life and said, oh, it was so different for me to be in a room full of people who were like wearing pantyhose and like high heels and things like that. Not everyone was, and there was a whole mix of people from different walks of life, and like no shade on pantyhose or high heels. If you love it, wear it. But I noticed in myself a pressure to like put on the kind of professional mask that I used to feel was just a given in professional realms. And I didn't do that. And I feel a need and a push to ask the question. I'll just skip to it actually. Let's see. Oh, I don't know where it went. I might just have to remember it. Oh, here it is. How do we go deeper, faster, stronger? And one of the main speakers at this conference used this word of like saying there's so many one-offs around the world of community ownership. And how do we go deeper, faster, stronger with spreading these models out into the world and changing the system? And so my question is, how do we do that? How do we go deeper, faster, stronger to move out of the existing system and into something different without perpetuating the mindsets that got us into this mess in the first place? So how do we avoid burnout culture, grind culture, competitiveness, achievements? And ultimately that is, flipping around, bear with me. To me, what that comes down to is dominance culture, which is shown here as ego-logical, versus partnership culture, something that's more collaborative and ecosystem-minded, shown here as ecological. So the dominance culture or supremacy culture is this idea that at the heart of everything is competitiveness. There will always be a winner. There's always someone on top of the food chain. And that's going to be humans. It's going to be white people. It may be men. Those kind of ideas are sort of baked into our existing culture. And that's in my view, and I'm not the only one who feels this or has said this, the biggest thing for us to do now is to pull ourselves out of a culture, practices, mindsets, policies, the water we swim in as being in dominance culture, and to come into this more ecosystem minded way of being, living, existing, and regulating or policying, or economicing. I'm verbing all over the place. The way that all of these things that are baked into the way that we live our lives on an everyday level, and then all of the structures and policies that either hinder or support us living our everyday lives in the way we want to. The other piece that feels really related to that for me is the idea coming back to, in a deep way, the idea that we as humans are part of the web of life rather than being separate from it, and how much we as a society, luckily, are slowly waking up to the idea that we've really lost the thread on that, and that in as we start to hear our dear friends who are Indigenous, on a deeper level, that's been one of the things that I, as far as I understand, as a white settler, that we've been missing all along, is to say, hey, you're forgetting, you're part of the web of life. Why are you building these structures that are taking away from the web of life rather than acknowledging that you're part of them? And, in that, hey, guess what? You can have it all. You don't need to, try to fight for it. There's enough to go around. All of those deep abundance, and deep relational mindsets that we've lost sight of, and have the capacity and the necessity to come back to. So on that note, just checking in on the time, I think I'll leave my talking there, and I'd love to come into a question. If I can find the one that I wanted to ask. I don't think I have a slide on it, actually. I'll call attention back to a question I said at the beginning, which is, what is a vision for a different or better way to live? What is a vision for a different economic system, political system, community system? But I'd like to pull that question into our everyday lives, and instead focus on the question of what do we want our everyday lives to look and feel like? If we could wave a magic wand high in the sky, imagine the perfect life, and not just for us as individuals, but our let's say our close community, or the community like just outside of our close community, what would that look and feel like? So I'd love to take a few minutes just to maybe feel into that individually. We could take another few deep breaths, and then if we can go into a discussion about it among our small group of 4 today. Okay, does anyone feel called to start?
Can you repeat the question again?
I can.
Back, there, back.
What do we want our lives to look and feel like? What would be the absolute ideal perfect life if you didn't have any barriers, if you could wave a magic wand and create it for yourself and for your community?
This is a simple response, but a life that is meaningful. Or in the way we connect, the way we work, the way we just are and exist feels meaning. And I don't think that is, we might think that way, but where does that meaning come from? Is it from a career in the end when we we leave this life? Well, there's not, it kind of devalues when you start to think of that finite part of our lives as being, or our times as humans, right? It's like, what is it that truly is meaningful while we have this finite life we live? And are we able to get it now, or produce it, or find it, or feel it?
Mm. Beautiful. And do you, maybe I'll turn it to the others before you answer this, Krista, but if you could think about like, what does meaning mean for you when you say meaningful? And maybe that's something we can all feel into as well.
When I hear you ask that question, I kind of go to adjectives. So, and then I also think about actual like hard structures. Like, so I'm thinking two different ways. Like, I want to live in a community that's connective. Like we're connected. There's a sense of abundance. It feels safe. It feels safety. It's easeful. It's collaborative. Um, uh, and what I'd love to see is more artistic and creative, like that gets valued just as much as everything else. And I liked what you said, Krista, about meaningful. I might say purposeful, so, but I think we're talking about the same thing, like where we're doing something in our lives not just to pay the bills, but that this is my unique gift. This is the expression of it, and this is how I add to our community. Yeah. So I think of those kind of from objectives kind of points of view, and then more, sorry, from adjectives, and then from a more objective point of view, I think of like, because I've been listening a lot to you about like the food stuff you've been doing and the housing stuff that Lindsay's doing, and I'm like, those are kind of like feel like two really big things right now that we need help with, like, right? How do we have safe, affordable, maybe housing that actually promotes villaging as opposed to separate little units everywhere, right? And then food. I'm just imagining stuff. I'm just spitballing here. It's like, how do we, like all the farmers that are, say, in the Cowichan Valley, how do we support them into, I think you called them food hubs, and then for all of our community members to shop at the food hub and like just have it like have our little community, you know? So those are just a few things that rise to the top for me on that question.
Beautiful. Thanks, Trevor.
Hi, Robin. I can't figure out how to turn my video on. So anyways, I'll just talk. Yeah, so what kind of came to me is a little bit of a model like the First Nations, where it isn't just random people living together. It's actually families. And the accountability of the families through, you could say, the closeness, the intimacy of families is like a container that can hold all kinds of things. In our current culture, family is not highly regarded. But then when we try and think of village or community, it's really difficult because nobody trusts anybody to hang in. Like when things get hard or when finances are difficult. So there is this almost built in to our humanness, this obligation to family. And so it, to me, is kind of like this, the bones of village, the bones of community, which we've kind of tossed aside. And then we wonder how we can get people to commit to something. So, if I think of it in a financial model, like, we own the land here at Sancta Amo. If I said to people, let's do a cooperative here, but then next year the roof has to be replaced, it's cost 20 grand, are you in? People go like, well, no, I can't afford that. You know what I mean? Like, there isn't this like longevity in the system to believe that you're still going to be part of this village when you're 60. And that, I think, is the tricky part. Like, we can't count on each other. We can't imagine doing that. You know what I mean? And so when we talk about shared assets and share this and share that, I'm like, we're talking about people's survival here. Like, who's going to step in and help people when they need to be, when there's support required. And so I guess what I'm saying here is, like, there is that intrinsic knowing in family that we're in this together. And so if we actually start thinking about, if we want to build community, that we're all in this together and there's nowhere to go. Like, I don't know if you've ever talked to people who live on reserve, First Nations people. Do you know how bad it is on reserves? It's really bad. Well, guess why they're there? Because that's their homeland. That's where they live, and they're not going anywhere. Do you hear settlers talk like that? No, it's like, things get bad, we're gone. So it's a really interesting shift in consciousness around what we're committed to and what we'll stand with when things are difficult. Like, who will be responsible? How will we do this? How will we figure this out? Those kinds of things. So I'm just going down right to the bare bones here, like, because that's what comes up for me around this, is like the level of commitment that we need to really make this work.
Yeah. And I appreciate you going to the bare bones. And I hear that from you, Tricia, and from Trevor and Krista's responses as well. And Rochelle just joined us. She can't stay for too long, but she said, so well said, Trevor and Tricia. She didn't hear you, Krista, but I'm sure she'd say that about you too. Rochelle, if you'd like to chime in by voice, if there's anything you'd like to say about, the life that you want to live as an individual, or the life that you'd love to see for your wider community, you're very welcome. And your mouth is full of food, so good. We got to take care of our basic needs. Great. So anything else that you want to do another round of sharing in terms of what comes up for you around this question?
I've got a kind of a more deeper philosophical kind of thing that's cropping up for me. Like, I think, like, when you talk about the shift from ego-logical to ecological, right? And I just, if we back really far out, like, what I see as the shift is kind of like a shift from an I consciousness to a we consciousness, the individualistic orientation that has been really driven into our system. And then I hear things like, your pain is my pain, like an understanding that we can't separate that. Feel, your gain is my gain is your gain, like that there's these, to shift philosophically or from that paradigm, into something where we feel that positive or negative, those effects, whoever they're with, they are ultimately part of me too. And I think when we have that orientation, all these things start to make more sense and we can orient to them much more easily,
Mm.
And it's hard to get out of that mindset. I think, it's been tricky, like, because there's so much fear and scarcity in the world. It just keeps our nervous systems at this like heightened kind of like take care of number one, right? It's kind of it's a natural human response, I think, when we're overwhelmed, when we're fearful, when we're in scarcity. it's a natural thing to go to. How do I, so our survival mechanism gets kicked in. So it's like, I think as long as that survival mechanism is being like poked at all the time, it's going to be hard for us to think more, more we orientation. And I think that's what I see in the world. It's like media and just like food and housing, everything, the scarcity is just really making it hard for us to support each other. Harder, you know? So that's why I don't watch media, because I don't want that fear, drip. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I think too, that's the current system. And it's hard to shift when we talk about even like looking at housing. This is how it is, and it is in a scarcity because it's a commodity. It's a commodity. It has to be, right? Because this is how we perpetuate and inflate this asset. And then when we're shifting towards this abundant, because it can be when it's it's almost like a cultural ideological shift that goes along with this economic change as well that I think we're thirsting for. So, yeah, the me to we, and me is valued, we is
Right.
not.
Yeah,
That's right.
and it's a chicken or an egg question right now to say that, the mindset perpetuates the system we're in, and the system perpetuates the mindset we're in. So how do we build the plane while we're flying it, shed the system and the mindset at the same time?
Yeah.
And we're doing it. So yay to us, slowly but surely at the pace that we're able to. And conversations like this feel very powerful to me. And it reminds me, Krista and I held a meeting with one of our clients last week about designing a sexual assault services hub in a way that feels healing, supportive, calming for people who have experienced significant trauma. And we went in with a question of, how can we design systems that feel like they, or locations, contact services that feel supportive? And we remarked as we were planning this meeting that just asking that question feels powerful because it's not asked very often. I'm like, why isn't it? I don't know. I just like, I kind of marvel at that. I've heard it talked about as a crisis of imagination, a crisis of hope, even. That we look so much there. I mean, there are so many deep problems in our existing system that it's easy to spend a lot of time like being like, oh my goodness, what's wrong there? But the more we turn our attention to like what is possible. Anything else that comes up in terms of what's possible, or what you want for your life, for your community members?
Well, yeah, I could add a few things. I mean,
Mhm.
ideally, if we're stuck the word ideal in there, ideally, I and other community members would have interpersonal skills that would support the communication, accountability, skill levels of shared ownership, shared decision making, shared accountability. I feel like those skill sets are undeveloped because we haven't done them. And so just building those skills and having people be skilled in being able to do that would be revolutionary. Because even if we're not living all in the same house, if we have shared ownership of assets, we are, in a sense, living in each other's pockets. And so that requires a different level of being able to work through things. So that's what I would want, so that people don't get frustrated and quit, but they're able to stay in and be kind with each other and love each other and support each other. Yeah.
You hated
We're
that.
all nodding
Yeah.
enthusiastically. I think not the least of which I know, Trisha, you live in community, and Trevor and I live in a communal house, and we feel that. Krista living with family and working collaboratively, we feel that. Feel the lack of that kind of skill.
Yeah.
And it strikes me as this type of interpersonal skill is, again, sort of chicken or egg. We lack those skills because of the system, and it's hard to build the system without those skills. So it's just acknowledging the complexity of, sort of use this metaphor again, building the plane while we fly it, that we're doing really powerful work in the world right now, individually, those of us on the call, and also as a society right now. We're watching our current system unravel, and we're going, oh gosh, what do we do? Or, oh yay, what do we get to do? Usually more of the first one, but
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Got something else I could throw into. Something I'd love to see is, I don't know what I would call it. Maybe like cross-generational learning and support. Because I think in our culture these days, our generations kind of hang out with each other as opposed to cross-pollinate, and you know, the loss of eldership and stuff like that. And but the other way too is that, you know, I've met plenty of young people who have just such inspiring ideas. And so how do we get that? How do we get that pollination going across the generations? Because in fact, you know, Trisha, when you were running that youth, those youth conversations about what are the youth, what do they need? My son's answer to that was, I need some good role models. I don't have any role models. And yeah, so how do we make those links? And I guess when we live in more of a village type situation, it's going to be more, and we hang in there, like you were saying, Trisha, like it feels like that's more possible. But I definitely love to see more of that, where elders are more respected and the young people are, and everyone in between. We all have gifts, right? Wisdom is on the end, and new ideas are in the beginning, and like got all sorts of, and the people in the middle are like doing the making the stuff happen. It's like, it's really cool. So I'd love to see the cross-generational learning support.
Well,
Yeah.
did you want to add anything there, Trisha?
Wish I could get my camera to work. Now I've got myself in a situation, can't figure out how to get out of it. Yeah. I think that is a really key point, is even at this point, that people who have got some skills and some vision are including the young people. I mean, I think that was one of the drive of having those sessions, Trevor, was to pull the young people into the whole plan, instead of just thinking, oh, we need to get inexpensive housing for them. It's like the engagement at this level is important, because this process, I'm guessing, is going to take a decade or 3. And so it's not like it's going to happen tomorrow. So the people who are going to be in leadership are the young people that are present right now. And so I think that's a really key point.
Yeah.
When you say this process, do you mean sort of coming out of the existing system and coming into a new way of being, or
Yeah.
something different?
Yeah, like that. Like the change we want to see has to engage the young people in it. Like it just, otherwise it won't work, because then you're just going to leave some young people in the system the way it is, you know. I think it can be done without them. It can't be done without them.
Mhm. Yeah, well said. I have another question that builds on this other question. Feel free to keep saying, ideal things about how we want to live, because I think we can't have enough of that conversation. What needs to happen to support these ways of living? I think we've touched on some of these things a little bit. In fact, some of the answers are both this is how we want to live and this is how we might get there. But the question is to more explicitly think about it. It kind of gets us into the territory of thinking about what's currently in the way and how might we move past it. So if a big barrier is in the way and you're just not really sure how to move past it, that's also okay to say. So I'll just say the question again. What needs to happen in order to support these different ways of living?
I'll speak up. I'm all fired up here.
Great.
So as a systemic level, pressure in the authorities right now, pressure with the authorities to change what I would call the basic controlling laws, codes, blah, blahs that affect everything. And so that's one thing, those structures, right? And I know there are people who put pressure on those systems all the time, and I think there just needs to be more of that. So like land codes and, all that kind of stuff. And the other thing, which I think is more uncomfortable, is the movement towards expecting less. And I know that people don't want to hear that. But seriously, I know, Robin, you said earlier that, the abundance, there's enough for everyone. I actually seriously doubt that. We've got 9 billion people on this planet. If we think of ourselves as one unit, that's a lot of people. And if our expectations for how we're going to live and our lifestyle and blah, blah, blah gets higher and higher and higher through whatever marketing or whatever, or you're trying to keep up with the Joneses, we're hooped.
Mhm.
So, so if we want to have a sustainable life, we have to reduce our expectations about what we deserve in terms of groceries from exotic countries to the houses we live in to, all kinds of stuff, the cars we drive. We just have to lower our expectations and be realistic with what this earth can actually support. We all may come crashing down and we have no choice. But I think at this point, consciously choosing less is actually a good thing.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I am often so steeped in these ideas that I forget that when I say there's enough to go around, that it's a certain kind of enough.
Mhm.
And the idea that to live simply so others may simply live, the idea of materially simple and relationally rich. I see Krista
Gonna say
nodding
that.
because we really like that phrase. That the underlying theory that I've heard said, that I believe in, that drives greed or scarcity
Mhm.
is that there's not enough, so I need to grab and hold and hoard. And what we're moving into is, let's believe that people around me will take care of me, that the earth will take care of me, that there's enough for me to eat, that I will be held and kept warm and dry and safe. And like, I'm tearing up saying that, because we have been told in many different ways that that's not the case. And it makes us scared, and it makes us, I'll say again, grab and hoard and fight. And it's simply not true. And like, ultimately, is there enough food on the earth that everyone will get enough to eat? I actually don't know the answer to that question, but my suspicion is yes, especially the more we get into this habit, like you said, Tricia, so beautifully, of just expecting less. But I think what I've thought about with this is that I noticed a narrative in the like climate change conversation of sacrificing. We need to sacrifice to save our earth. And I was like, this isn't working. And I don't think it's true. I think underlying it is we think we get a sense of enoughness and abundance and enjoyment from our things, but we actually don't. We get that from belonging to the earth, from deep, meaningful connection with the people around us, with our communities, and with ourselves as well. And all of that is like missing in the existing narrative.
And I wonder too, like with this whole conversation we've been having about revillaging and coming together, right? Like when we live in our separate little homes and we don't have a perception of other than perhaps social systems that are supposed to take care of us when things get in trouble, as opposed to a village that will catch us when we fall. You know, like I'm still a huge believer that it takes a village to raise anything or to do anything. It's just, that's what I think Ian was making this point on that podcast the other day, that it's only been a blink of an eye that it's actually been a long time since we've lived in village, but relatively speaking, that's a blink of an eye compared to hundreds of thousands of years where that's how we sustain each other in so many ways, right? So if we, in this movement towards building our community and revillaging, that we would feel safe, we would feel caught, held, and that our nervous systems could then be more open. Like I wrote down here, if we had less fear and less scarcity or those concepts, and we could gain that by being in the village, that would go a long way to supporting us in the shift of trusting the net that's below us. Because right now, for most people, they don't have a net. They have a social net that they can see is crumbling. What's a more sustainable? I've got your back. I've got you when you fall. Like, and that's, village is a verb.
Village is a verb. Yeah, I'll just say what Trevor's referring to is we went to a live webinar by Ian McKenzie and the other filmmakers from the Village of Lovers the other day. And it was called Beyond Just Us. And it was about the idea that communities can support romantic relationships. And they unfolded a lot of sort of deep understanding of dominance culture and partnership culture at this sort of heart of what's wrong in a lot of society, including what kind of breaks relational ties. And they said villaging is a verb. And I thought both Trevor and I like wrote that down.
Yeah. We're gonna make a t-shirt.
Yeah. So other thoughts related to this idea of villaging, expecting less, or other things that might support these more ideal ways of living?
I think I'm gonna speak to a youth perspective where it's uncomfortable when you're asked to expect less. And it lands, doesn't always land, I think, the way we intended to, especially when you're thinking like, okay, like for me, I'm thinking when I was a child and I needed to see a doctor, the doctor came to our house. I have to to do the ear. Like that was back in the day. I'm like, wow, that was amazing. We had these systems. And now to see for an ear infection, you stand in line in 20 minutes outside in the cold. And it's like these shifts that we've experienced. And I think a generation's feeling very like less than, but it's not, you don't want that system. You know what I mean? It's like we have to bring it about. And I don't have the wording for this, but it's creating a better, accepting or working towards a better system. Because this one, it worked for a few and it worked well for those few who don't want to give it up, but it doesn't work for everybody. And who was left out here? And this new way that we can move towards is more beneficial. We might not have everything that we once had or saw that our parents or grandparents had, we have something, we could have something better, and everybody can have something better. So I think there's just like a phrasing what that needs, and I'm not sure about, because I know there's a lot of anger right now in our youth and frustration at the system and valid. But how do we like funnel and channel this towards that change, towards that new world that we're weaving in? And so, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have that. I wish I had, if we had that answer, it would be wonderful. But we're doing it. We're creating the plane. I love that phrasing.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that point, Krista. It feels like there's a lot here to unpack around. There's enough leaning into abundance, acknowledging frustration, acknowledging that there is less in some ways, even if there's more in others. And that's there's an unlearning.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, shifting mindsets is deep work.
Yeah.
Robin, I liked what you said that, and you've said that line many times, materially simple, relationally rich. Like, I think like with what you're saying, Krista, is like, and instead of it, like it was seeing it as a loss, it's actually a reorientation to what is real true wealth. And perhaps that's much more relational than it is material. I mean, because when people are on their deathbeds, they're not thinking about the millions of dollars they saved. They're thinking about were they loved, did they love well, and were they loved well? Like, so I really love that kind of paradigm shift to presenting it as that. How, and maybe it's villaging, maybe these things are what, because that, I mean, my son feels alone. He's isolated. He's got a cheap apartment, but he's isolated. So I really love that statement that you have. I think that's something we need to start thinking about and moving towards the relationally rich piece. And that's how we're actually going to be healthier physically. There's all sorts of things that we're going to shift in that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you know what? I realize I'm speaking between every single person. Maybe that's loud, but does anyone else want to speak before I go next?
Yeah, I feel the pain of the aloneness in our current culture and the systems we've created and the breakdown of family and the breakdown of village. Yeah, that aloneness and the need to belong is driving a lot of people into pain, basically, because it's, in some ways, that is our inherent birthright, is to belong. And so that piece has been taken away. So it's got nothing to do with stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's got to do with connections with people that are, as someone mentioned earlier, meaningful, right? It was you, Krista, purposeful or whatever. Like, we have this sense of connection that is really what feeds us. And without that, everything else just seems meaningless and hopeless, because that inner hunger is never filled. So I think that is a big piece of it. And, in terms of revillaging, I think that is kind of what people sense is possible, that I won't be alone in this. But then if we don't have the theology or whatever to rally around, then it ends up happening in village too. So it's I think it's a really important piece. And I just want to mention here that, and I've probably said this before, but I just want to say it again, when we look at the First Nations and the fact that they lost their village, right? The settling destroyed their village. They know that. It's so recent. They actually know it. And they feel the loss, they feel the pain, and they're struggling to get it back again, right? But us settlers, we lost it so long ago. We're talking about like 500, 600 years ago, when we were colonized over in Scotland, England, Wales, wherever we came from, Europe, that we don't remember we had it. It's so gone in our memory. So what we need is, we need to actually feel it in our bones And I think that's the challenge, is to actually understand at that deep level what we are longing for and what that can look like in terms of how that will support the restructuring of what we're in right now, which doesn't fulfill any of that.
It's so beautifully said, and anyone seeing the video will see the nodding and I mean, I feel the emotion that comes up in me when we acknowledge the extent to which people feel loneliness, aloneness, and a lack of belonging. And I would guess that we all feel that on some level. And what I'm wondering is whether or not at the heart of every question in terms of how to move forward, there needs to alongside it be how do we build belonging? That's just really centering that in everything. I like that you how you worded it, Trisha, or not worded it, but conceptualized it. So if we are constantly asking the question of how to build belonging, how to build ecosystems of belonging, just pulling in like that other question that I mentioned earlier. And what is an economic system that includes belonging look like? It sounds like such a paradox, which is like interesting, because I meant to have the definition ready, but the word economics comes from Greek, and it means how we organize our house, our home. And I'll find the actual, like the full definition for that, because I may be missing a piece, but that's my understanding of it. And like we hear that and we're like, oh, that's very different than our like connotation for economics. Economics feels outside of the house. It's everything that's not important to humans, or it's outside of our control. So yeah, belonging and economics, and what is a economic system looks like that serves our need for belonging, that serves us rather than impedes us, is really like on my mind and heart right now. And we have about 15 minutes left in the scheduled time, and I just want to note that I started out being like, I'm not sure how long this conversation will be, and here we are. Obviously, it's one that's close to our hearts, and thank you, Trevor and Krista and Trisha, for bringing such beautiful heart and insight. And I really look forward to more of this connection moving forward. And I want to move into saying a couple of things about next steps. One is just noting again that I am excited to have a rhythm of shared inquiry like this today has been, and to find threads that we get to build on together. And we share community geographically. Trevor and Trisha and I are in the same region. There's other people who I have invited to join. The next few that we have some capacity to look at the Cowichan Valley as a place that we can continue to, because I think there's a lot of really great work happening already. And Krista is just across the inlet. What is anyway, she's just
Burrard
the Salish Sea, the Burrard Inlet.
The Salish, yeah.
My geography is poor. She's in New Westminster, and we work together. So the capacity to bring this work into communities, and we've also been working with Tapestry Collective, and there's a whole lot of beautiful community building happening in the Kamloops region. That's how we all met, was in the Kamloops region. So there's incredible food system, housing, belonging, community building happening. led by two of our colleagues, Bonnie and Lindsay, in a really big way. So we will be sharing more about the work that we do, how we do it, and what we're seeding, what we're finding, and what we're building in the communities in some future discussions. We also have started a document that we're calling "What is the world we want to live in?" or "What are ways we want to live?" And we've broken that down into a few different areas, including housing, connection with land, how we want to relate, and how we want to work, what work could look like. And it's interesting to get into the discussion today and hear just how much of the tone of what we've drafted already is captured in the way that you all speak. And I think we were in a conversation, a team meeting the other day, and one of our team members, Lindsay, said, "This is not so complicated. We actually all at the heart of us know what we want, what we need, even as much as we've lost sight of it over the past millennia, however long it's been." And there is a level of complexity to dreaming and visioning and building this way, because our system puts us in a place of needing to constantly think about our survival, and some of us more than others. If we don't know where our next meal is coming from, or where we're going to live, or don't have safe housing, it's very hard, if not impossible, to get into this level of conversation. So I consider it a privilege and a obligation, with where I'm at in my own life, to be able to move these conversations forward and to bring alongside those who aren't able in the same way to do the active work of this building. But the tension is, how do we hear those voices that are not, that aren't as present, who are marginalized and oppressed, and just classically not listened to anyway, to make sure that whatever world we're building, we're bringing them along. Just similar to what you said, Trisha, about needing, we can't do this without youth. We also can't do this without the voices of those who are currently unhoused, who are currently oppressed or marginalized. So how to do that, I think, is an ongoing inquiry and question. The best we can do is ask and deeply listen the best we can. So I think I got into kind of a segue, but I was saying that we've been working on this beautiful document called "What is the World We Want to Live In?" That's the working title. And we plan to highlight it, spotlight it on a future community discussion with Weaving the Future here. So what I heard today, I'm going to compare and integrate. And I want to continue to have these kind of building conversations, crowdsourcing conversations, to understand how are people, what do people, how do we want to live? And are there things that we haven't yet heard or thought about? Or is there any areas that we're missing as we build this kind of vision? And I'm very excited about building visioning documents, especially not just like your classic one sentence, "This is our vision for the world," that tend to sort of, how could you say in one sentence exactly what we need? Because there's a lot. So we have done this with the food system and some other work as well, where we have more of a comprehensive sort of vision poem that actually elicits a feeling of what would that look and feel like to live in that way. And it also bakes in some of that theory of change, or some of that how question of how do we want to live and how might we get there. So that's, we had the experience back in October when me and Krista and Bonnie and Lindsay as Tapestry had a retreat. And we've been asking these questions of like how we want to live for the entire time we worked together. And we went out for this big long walk and we said, let's just try to do this. And we sat down together for half an hour to an hour and just typed it out. And we got a pretty good first draft from doing that. And I think that's just a testament to the level to which we've been deeply listening and looking for these answers, but also the level to which it lives in us. The feeling of looking for joy, belonging, meaning, and having a sense of what that looks and feels like. So I'm very excited to talk about that in the coming months. And I believe the plan is to either talk about that in June, which is the second Thursday in June would be the next meeting of community discussion. I believe it's June 13th. Or we may have a discussion that's more focused on communal living, which is one of those big topics. And what I mean by communal living is living in a way where we feel belonging. So it's not only eco-villages or communal houses, it's living in a way where we're connected with our community members. So I will send out a note as soon as possible about what that topic will be. And some of that will depend on, I really want to make sure that those who really want to be part of that conversation, part of any of those conversations are able to be there and kind of ready to engage. So yeah, I also would like to, in the coming months, have a more of a deep dive into this community ownership, maybe bringing in some folks who we met at the conference to talk more explicitly about it and what we all might do to get on board with that movement. So that's what's upcoming. Any other thoughts or questions or excitements before we end today?
Well, I'm just delighted to be here with you in this conversation, and yeah, looking forward to more.
Great. Thank you so much for coming, Tricia, and thank you, Krista and Trevor. It means a lot to me to have you three, who I feel such deep connection and belonging with, to be in this level of deep conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It means a lot to me to see you spearhead this stuff and,
Yeah.
get this podcast up and running, and just feels so good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay, to be continued. Okay, take good care. Talk soon.
Thanks all.
Bye now.
Bye,
Thanks, Robin.
everyone.